Hey guys, the Network Berg here, hope you've been doing well. So, we are going to be looking at something called fantasy routes on MikroTik. Now, what is a fantasy route? What do you think of? Well, I kind of think of routes that live in Middle Earth for some reason, but that's just my head being a bit weird. But fantasy routes are really amazing because they allow you a way to quickly orchestrate or create a ton of routes on a MikroTik device. So instead of using stuff like scripts or adding a bunch of loopback addresses and adding IPs to a loopback address, you can use a fantasy route emulator or simulator on RouterOS version 7 to quickly create these routes. They are seen as active routes on your network. And what makes this nice is you can have this now for two different purposes. One being you can actually stress test your equipment to see how well it will function under a large routing table, because you can literally add hundreds of thousands of routes if you want. Or it's also very useful for people that I try and make the videos for, which is aspiring network engineers, because maybe you want to learn a lot more about OSPF or BGP or all those other protocols, and you're not sure. Just redistributing or advertising a single route that's on your router doesn't always feel nice. So this gives you a way to quickly have a big routing table and playing around with the routes, because you can advertise fantasy routes from a MikroTik to other MikroTiks. And what makes this really cool for me as well is this isn't limited to MikroTik. You can have the fantasy routes exist or originate from the MikroTik device, but you can use something like BGP to advertise those fantasy routes out to another device like a Cisco or a Juniper or something else, so that you can actually get a full-on experience for all of this. So this is really phenomenal. So let's actually look at how we can create fantasy routes on MikroTik. So let's actually look at configuring this on our MikroTik devices. Now, again, first prerequisite is you need to have RouterOS version 7 for this to work. It does not work on version 6. And second thing is you also need to do this all from the command line. So there is no GUI that you can actually use or create fantasy routes from. So what I'm just going to do is I'm just going to head into Winbox, and I'll use the Winbox terminal for connectivity. So let's quickly just get onto my downloads folder. I'll use Wine, because a lot of people see me use Winbox on Linux, which freaks them out. And this is how I use a application called Wine to basically emulate these apps on Linux. And now we can see this device. I'm going to connect to it. And ta-da, here we are on a MikroTik. And how do we actually access the fantasy routes? So first things first, get into your terminal window. And then from the terminal, if you type in routing and you go filter or fantasy, there's where the fantasy routes and magic happens. Now I want you to check out this routing table. I'm actually going to look at my IPv4 routing table, which is pretty barren at the moment. I've got a bunch of directly connected routes, and I have one static route out to the internet. So, you know, pretty straightforward stuff. So how about we add a fantasy route to this routing table so we can get a bit of a feel for how this works. So all that I'm going to do is, from my fantasy routes, we can first just issue a print to see if anything exists. We see nothing exists. So what we can do is add, and then if we tab this, we can get a list of different commands that we can use. Now you can give this a name. So maybe I'll give this a name as, is this the real route? Is this a fantasy? And what we'll do with this fantasy route is we will actually specify destination address. Now think of this as just the destination address in your routing table. If I look at IP routes, destination address, this is basically just the prefix or the network that exists in the routing table. So I'm going to say this is going to be for 10.128.00/16. And at its basis, this is all we need to actually add a fantasy route. If I hit enter, it should add the fantasy route. So if I go back to my IP routes, we should see that there is a 10.128.00/16. But I do see that it is being hardware offloaded. Reason being is I didn't specify any type of gateway. So let's quickly do that as well. So what I can do is just update this. So I'll do a print again, and then I can just do a set gateway. And then I can either set this to a gateway IP like my normal gateway, which is 192.168.149.2, or I could specify an interface which would then just generate a random gateway. So let me give you an example. If I specify ether1 for item 0, and I go back into my routing table, there we go. Now we can see this route is actually active, it's black, it's ready, it's good to go, and it's given me some random gateway via ether1. Great, so now we have a single fantasy route. So how about we want to make this many? So how can we do that? Well, same principle. We can just do a up. We can add I can use the same name if I want, or I can use a different name. It doesn't really matter too much, but I can specify the destination address. I'm going to leave this as the same network, so 10.128.00/16. But here's where it gets cool. Okay, let's specify the gateway again as Ether1. And if I do a prefix length, you can actually specify how many subnets you want to divide this into, or what the prefix length is you want to add. So I'm going to make this maybe a bunch of /24s. So my prefix is 24, and I can also specify a count. So how many routes do I want to add? Now I want to actually try and minimize this and put the route list here at the bottom so that you can actually see how this routing table is going to grow, because maybe I'm going to add 10,000 routes. Now this is going to get crazy. So once I hit enter, holy cannoli, I can see a ton of routes that got added here. So 10,000 routes almost instantaneously got added. And I could promise you, when I've done this manually on my streams where I've copy pasted routes across, it takes a super long time to get this done. And this is just a really quick and nice way to add these types of routes. But wait, there's more. And this is where it gets even crazier. So Fantasy Routes is not just limited to IPv4. Maybe you want to learn a bit more about IPv6 as well. You can populate an IPv6 routing table this same way. Same thing, because this is not an IPv4 thing exclusively. It works for IPv6. So let's do a add. I'll give it a name. Is this the real IPv6? Our destination address. So now I need to work with an IPv6 address. So maybe I'll just make it 2001 00/64. I will make my gateway Ether1 again. And I will also just do a prefix length, and this I'm going to make as a 128, which is a single host in an IPv6 network. And let's just also add maybe 20,000 of these. Wait, that seems a bit much. There we go, 20,000. So let me open up my IPv6 routing table, and we can see this is also pretty barren at the moment. So the moment I hit enter, ta-da! This is some crazy stuff, guys. So now we have a big IPv6 routing table as well that we can play around with, and we can learn a lot more by using this with routing protocols, again, like OSPF or BGP. And I'll definitely be using this in separate videos with those protocols to show you guys how cool and quick and easy this is. So I hope this has been informative. I'd like to thank you guys for watching, and I'd also just like to thank my Patreon and YouTube members for helping support the channel, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. See ya.